everyone, I am back. Okay, that was a little bit silly. This week, I'm going to be doing another World War II figure for you because it's been a while. I thought specifically I'd revisit the Italians. Now, I have done a normal Italian infantryman, and I will link that below in the description box, but I have had a couple of requests for an Italian World War II paratrooper. So that's what I'm going to be doing this time. I've got a great figure picked out for that. That's one reason I felt like doing it. I have one of these kind of old bolt action Italian paratroopers from Warlord. They're really nice. They're kind of chunky, solid figures, the kind I really like to paint. So that was a little bit inspirational for me. Now, the other reason I also want to be doing an Italian paratrooper is because they're wearing Italian camouflage. And while I very briefly touched on it in my last video, I wanted to cover it a little bit more extensively for you because it is a really nice, easy, attractive camo pattern. You can do it pretty quickly and it looks really nice. And even if you're not going to be doing an Italian army, it's still pretty useful because the Germans also really like the pattern, and particularly German officers and elite units were known to make sort of non-regulation pieces of clothing out of it to mix into their uniform. So jackets and pants and stuff, they were cut in the same way as a piece of German clothing, but then in the Italian pattern. So if you are thinking about, having a more interesting German army, you can mix in, some, officers or maybe SS, elite type units who have bits of this Italian camouflage on them. So, let's see. I think that's everything, so I'm going to get started. Now, for the sake of consistency, I'm going to be painting the uniform components here just in the same way I did in my other Italian tutorial, because I don't want to confuse you by doing the same thing in a different way. And I'm going to be doing his pants here in the sort of Italian uniform color, so what he has under his jump smock. And the base coat I'm using is a mixture of German gray with a bit of German uniform World War II added in. My next highlight layer is going to use the German uniform World War II as a base now instead of the German gray, and then it's going to be darkened slightly using the German gray. So I'm basically flip-flopping which color is my starting point here. So that means the end result is you have kind of a lighter color overall. And you can see I'm going to be layering that onto most areas of the pants except the very deepest folds and creases. I'm continuing to highlight now, this time with just pure German uniform World War II. I have, however, added in just a little bit of Oxford blue, which is kind of a blue-gray shade, which does darken it slightly, but it also adds a slight blue cast because the Italian uniform I feel it has a slight bluishness to it. If you look at different photographs, the amount tends to vary. Sometimes it looks very, very blue, almost like a Luftwaffe uniform. And other times it's really very, very green or gray. So I don't know, there may be some variation in the dye lots. But whatever you go for, I suggest you mix at least a little bit of blue into your paints here. And from now on, to continue highlighting, I am going to be mixing a bit of Vallejo Pale Blue, which is a very white pastel kind of baby blue color, into my German uniform World War II. The Oxford blue is still in there, but I'm going to be using this color to lighten it, and that's going to keep that blue cast, that slight blue cast that I want. As a matter of fact, it's going to make the green even a little bit minty looking. And as I just said, there's a lot of variations in the colors you see in the Italian uniform. So this variant that I'm showing here is going to be more on the green side. But if you prefer a bluer version of the uniform, you might want to consider mixing more blue in initially, just, or even starting with a blue base like Oxford blue or Luftwaffe uniform and then greening it up slightly. But that's really up to you. So I'm going to be just applying several layers of this color. You can see I'm going to be building it up on the light areas like his knees and around the bottoms of his pants, the tops of folds and creases. And I'm going to continue sort of lightening it up gradually by adding more and more of the pale blue in. The number of highlight layers you make, that's really up to you. I think I did 2 or 3, but you know, you can go quite far if you want. So I'm just going to continue doing that and continue blending the color out until I'm satisfied with sort of the highest highlight. I should point out too that you don't necessarily have to do these pants in this green blue color because Italian pairs also often wore a tropical uniform, especially probably when they were at home in Italy, in southern Italy a lot, or in North Africa, which is an area where they were very active, in which case you might want to give them a sort of a more brown, kind of khaki colored pants. So that's another variant on this uniform that you could choose, you know, just depending on where your particular, you know, guys are going to be fighting, I suppose. Now I'm going to be base coating the camouflage areas, which are basically, in this case, his jump smock and his helmet. And I am going to be using the German field gray World War II as the base here. And we're pretty early in the painting process, so there shouldn't be anything really challenging here. You just kind of slop the paint on. You don't really risk making too much of a mess. Don't forget his collar there. He does have a sort of a collar on the jump smock, so you want to make sure that you get that painted as well. Now, in order to help sort of darken the recesses and get some extra shading going on, and also just to get more of a greenish cast to my jump smock, because the German field gray is, well, it's pretty gray, and I do want a little bit greener, I'm going to take a Quelea green shade wash from Citadel and apply that very generously over all the areas where I have camouflage. My first highlight on the camo smock and helmet is going to be just pure German field gray World War II. Again, I know I applied it once, but the uniform has become so much darker from that wash that you can go back over it and still see quite a strong difference. So you can see I'm going to be putting this color back pretty much everywhere except all of the sort of creases and seams and stuff in the fabric, all the really dark, deep areas. And in places like between his legs, you can kind of blend the color out into those areas so you keep a sort of a darker color there. So that green wash that I applied, I'm really only going to be retaining that, as you can see, really just in those sort of dark sort of edge and sort of crease areas. In order to highlight the smock and helmet cover, I'm going to be mixing some of that pale blue that I used earlier into my field gray. And that will not really add too much of a blue tinge if you're worried about that, but I'm mostly using it because it's a very much lighter color, and I do have it on hand already, so I like to work as much as I can with things I already have, because, you know, obviously the less different paints you have to get out, the more you can keep this simplified. So my first highlight layer just mixes a little bit of the pale blue in just to lighten my field gray slightly. And you can see here that I'm just working it onto all the tops of creases and folds and wrinkles. I'm applying it most areas, and I am applying it thinly and blending it out a little bit. And you can also go back over it, add a couple of layers to build up some sort of stronger areas of color, and then apply it a little bit more transparently in others so that you can get a little bit more sort of tonal range to the jump smock. I'm just going to continue that highlighting process just by making more layers that add more and more of the pale blue into them to get lighter and lighter shades. I would recommend you go probably for the nicest effect with maybe 2 to 3 sort of successive layers with more and more pale blue added. And you can see as I get lighter, I just apply the paint to the fewer and fewer areas and really focus it more and more along the high creases and seams until I get really down to the very end. The color that's sort of the lightest with the most pale blue in it, that is really, I'm going to be used mostly as an edge highlight, really very lightly along the tops of seams and folds. And, you know, on those straps on the helmet, of course, you're going to want to make sure those are quite nice and light, and around sort of where his jump smock fastens between his legs, those kind of areas you're just going to want to emphasize. And everywhere else, you know, these lightest colors, you just may want to apply them, perhaps, depending on how you do it, you may want to apply some, but then very thinly and just blend it out quite a bit, like say on his rear end or his elbows or places like that. And now I'm going to start working on the camo spots. Now, the Italian camo pattern is a mixture of kind of brown, large brown, kind of amoeba-like spots, I suppose. And the ground spots are quite big, and they have a pretty high frequency all over the uniform. And they shouldn't, the points, the blobs shouldn't be too pronounced, so they shouldn't stick out too much. They should, you know, they should be fairly sort of soft, undulating blobs. Sort of like, I don't know, what you might have on a cow or something, I guess. That you don't want them to be too exaggerated looking, I guess. But there should be a fair number of them. I am using a base color here, which is a mixture of German Camouflage pale brown and German Camouflage black brown. Obviously, there's a lot more pale brown in there. And I should point out, again, the shades of both the brown paint here and the green I already applied and the yellow I'm going to apply in a little bit vary greatly from batch of fabric to batch of fabric. So you can have browns like this that are very gray and light, and you have others that are this much darker red brown. With the yellows, you're going to have things that are really brilliant yellow, almost down to things that are very sort of a pale, muted yellow. Anyway, once I've finished blocking out those brown areas, I'm going to start highlighting them, and my first highlight here is just going to be pure German Camouflage pale brown. You can see I'm applying it to pretty much all of the dots, or I mean all of the blobs, except where there are deep creases or folds or seams, and I am not applying the color in those areas. So you can see there's a very sort of clear differentiation going on. And it results in a really attractive looking effect, especially since the dark paint also tends to stay a little bit around the edge of the blobs. I like how that looks too. Now, the amount you highlight camo spots, you know, you can go quite far, but generally for me it has to do with how complicated or difficult it is to do. In this case, since these are very large spots, they're quite easy to highlight and they benefit from extra highlighting. So with some things, I wouldn't go beyond this with the highlighting, but because these aren't so hard to do, I am going to add a third highlight layer. And I've made this by mixing a little bit of Vallejo beige into that German Camouflage pale brown. You can see I'm going to apply it very thinly and very lightly for the most part over my spots again. And as you can see, really focusing it more on areas where I think there's going to be more light hitting, like really if there's a sharp crease along the top of that or along seam edges, things like that. And you can see, you know, you wouldn't have to add this extra highlight step, but with a camo pattern like this where it's possible, you know, it just really benefits the overall look of the model. And the other element in the Italian camo pattern are sort of yellow spots. Now these spots are somewhat less frequent than the brown spots, but they're more importantly, they're a lot smaller. There's only ever very small blobs of yellow, and they tend to either be on top of or joining the brown spots, though you will sometimes just see them out by themselves. But when you're painting the model like this, you just want to make sure you get a good frequency of them so that there's a balance in the amount of colors. You want to make sure that you have sort of a balanced amount of the brown spots, the green ground color, and these sort of yellow dots. And I'm using a base here of Vallejo khaki gray. And then I'm going to make a first highlight color by mixing the khaki gray in with some of that beige I already had out. And just like as I did with the brown, I'm going to really be applying this first highlight everywhere except down in seams and creases, though I'm applying it fairly lightly, so there's some transparency, and you're still going to see some of that dark color showing through, and especially around the edges. And again, like I did before, I am going to add a second highlight, which I will do just by applying some pure beige to areas I really, really want to emphasize. So that's really going to be along seam edges, and really, like, for example, the straps of the helmet, those areas should be where it crosses those. It should be really very bright. So I'm going to, you know, pep those up just with that extra bright yellow layer because I can, because the pattern is simple enough and the areas are big enough that adding these kinds of highlights is not too onerous a task. And as you can see, I think the end result of, you know, taking the time and trouble to do this is, you know, is that you get a really nice, very sort of nuanced looking camouflage pattern. Now it seems that the Italian paras really like to go into battle carrying a lot of extra ammo, because all the pictures you see of them, they have a million zillion pouches and sacks and ammo carrying sort of things just strapped all over them. So not only are they wearing sort of a belt with ammo patches, they wear sort of vest over top of their jump smock that has a whole bunch of extra pouches for ammo attached to it. It's kind of an interesting thing. I've only seen it on them. There's probably some other units or forces who do it, but it's kind of new to me. Anyway, the color of this sort of over vest from what I was seeing is sort of a yellowish khaki color, and that goes for those sort of pouches on their belt as well. So I'm going to just base coat everything like that using Vallejo khaki here. I'm then going to start highlighting the vest, and it's a little bit tricky just because the sculpting on this figure is a little bit rough in these areas and also kind of obscured by his hands and some other things, which makes this a little hard. So you may have to use your paint to sort of add some artificial edges and kind of neaten things up a little bit. Anyway, I mixed the khaki here with kind of 50-50 with some beige, and that's going to be my first highlight. And I'm going to be putting that most everywhere except down in seams and cracks. So, you know, you can see along his back, I make sure to highlight the tops of all those little individual sacks, but leave lines and defining seams down between them. Don't worry too much about painting the closing flaps on these pockets. So there's that sort of that whole end where you've got the covering flaps, because those were actually made out of leather and not out of the same sort of canvas material. So we're going to tackle those a little bit later. Once you've got that initial highlight on everywhere, you can choose to go ahead and just add a bit more of the beige in to lighten it even more, and then just keep sort of applying successive highlights to brighten it up, because a lot of these, from what I can see, they were not very brown or dark. They were actually quite light and quite yellow, sometimes really as bright as the yellow in the camouflage pattern. I ended up applying the second lightening layer, and then I went ahead and just took some pure beige and applied that over top as another highlight. And then I finished off finally, because I still thought I needed to be a little brighter, by mixing some white into my beige. So I got a very pale kind of white yellow, and I used that kind of as an extreme edge highlight, really, along sort of the edges of pouch covers and along seams and stuff, just to really emphasize how light this vest is, and really, you know, emphasize it's really quite a bright, light yellow piece of equipment. And how much of what is left over on this para is going to be either a sort of a black or a gray color. So that's going to include his boots, his belt, the scabbard for his dagger. He has also black leather gloves on, his helmet strap, and as I mentioned, sort of the closure flaps on those ammo pouches that he's wearing on his vest should also be leather color, a black leather color. So all those areas, just to start out here, are going to get a base coat of just pure black. Next, I'm going to start highlighting the black and gray areas. I'm starting out here, as usual, with Vallejo German gray. And that's going to go really pretty much everywhere except down in any sort of seams or dividing lines. They can stay pure black. Along his hands, you're going to want to sort of highlight along his fingers and sort of the top ridges on his gloves, and leave a darker color down in there. Those leather flaps, I find them a little tricky to paint, honestly. You're going to want to make sure you leave that dark black dividing line down in between the individual flaps. That's really important to maintain that, but sort of try to get the lighter colors sort of around the outer seam ridges, if you can see them, and sort of also where they sort of go around a corner. I would highlight that and make it brighter. I'm then going to mix some neutral gray into my German gray. I get a little lighter color and start sort of gradually highlighting all of these areas a little bit, focusing just, on progressively areas that I want to be lighter, like his heels, the tips of his boots, as always, along sort of any sort of seam edges. On his belt, it's nice to sort of focus on the middle area and sort of so it gets kind of darker away from the center. And on his scabbard, you'll want it sort of probably a lighter highlight along the top. His gloves, again, focus on his fingers, sort of making them the lightest and going sort of darker back towards the back of his gloves. And I'm just going to keep doing this. I'm going to keep adding the neutral gray in, basically. At some point, I'm not going to use it on everything. So, things like his boots and his gloves, for example, I want them to be shinier. So I'm going to apply higher highlight colors to them, whereas I'm going to stop sooner on things like his belt and his helmet strap because they don't need as much emphasis. But on the boots and the really shiny leather bits, you can go all the way up to pure neutral gray, and you can even add a little bit of white in that to make it even brighter, and then really focus that on his toes and really the shiniest areas. On his gloves, you want to focus the brightest, lightest gray sort of over his knuckles and maybe on the tips of his fingers, but especially his knuckles, and sort of getting darker, going sort of in either direction out from there, because the knuckle is kind of, especially in these made fists, is where the light is really going to be hitting a lot, so you want that to look especially shiny. And on those sort of ammo flaps, or the flaps of those ammo pouches in the back, you want to make sure you've got sort of a light edge highlight sort of along that sort of where that edge where they go around a corner, because any sort of leather thing, you want to make it brighter and emphasize in any place where there would be you're expecting there to be extra light, and where there would be really a lot of light hitting, you get a little bit of a reflection, basically. At least that's the theory anyway. I'm now going to tackle a couple really small detail areas. So I'm going to base coat the handle of his dagger using German Camouflage black brown. And then I'm going to take the light gray I was using to highlight his boots and leather and mix a little German Camouflage pale brown into that and use that to highlight sort of his heels, the tips of his boots, to get a little bit more of a sort of brownish warm cast here and there into those areas, just to make them look a little dirty or worn or whatever. I'm also going to take the German Camouflage pale brown and also use it to very quickly add just a small highlight to that dagger handle once that base is dry. Now for the handle of his gun. This is a submachine gun, but it seems to have had a pretty extensive wooden barrel. Unusually so, I'd say, actually, for most submachine guns. But I'm going to be base coating the whole wood area starting out here in the German Camouflage black-brown. Then once that is dried, I'm going to take some Foundry Bay Brown, and I'm going to be going over pretty much the whole area, except sort of the really dark shadow areas and sort of the underneath of the gun. You can see I'm kind of blending out towards the back a little bit, but it's getting to be pretty much everywhere. I'm then going to take some Foundry Chestnut Shade, and I'm going to start working it along sort of all of the edges and corners. And, I'm going to apply it pretty heavily, like I always do with this sort of wood color. And sort of layer it on and blend it outwards from the edges always and keep building it up. But I'm going to be doing it pretty strongly. And then I'm going to take finally chestnut medium and do just the same thing. I'm just not going to apply as much of it or blend it out as much. And you can see I'm really going to use it as an edge highlight, really just run it along any sort of corners or edge pieces, but more as a clearly defined line and not try to smooth it or sort of layer it or blend it out to the extent that I did with the chestnut shade color. And now finally we've got the metal areas left to deal with, which are mostly going to be the gun barrel and pieces, the pommel of his dagger, and you might want to also paint some of the snaps or button closures on his, ammo pouches if you like. Anyway, I'm going to base coat all those areas using a mixture of German gray and WWII-era gunmetal, which is my sort of usual shade. It's basically a very metallic gray, dark gray color. And once you've got all those areas coated with the base, you should then go ahead and take some just pure WWII-era gunmetal, thin it down a little bit so it flows nicely, and then apply not too much of it to your brush and sort of very lightly brush it over. You don't want to really pour it on, you just want to go very lightly so your brush is just barely touching the surface, so it just sort of goes over a light layer onto all sort of the higher areas of the gun, but doesn't necessarily get down into all the cracks and recesses. Those can be a little bit darker, and you can feel free to sort of apply less of it in areas where there would be shadows, like underneath the gun barrel, for example, and build it up higher or brighter on sort of the top of the gun barrel, for example, or areas where you want more emphasis and a little bit more of a shiny effect to be happening. Okay, and here is our finished World War II Italian paratrooper. As mentioned earlier, I used the same colors and combos here, basically that I used in my normal Italian soldier tutorial, which I've linked below in the description box. I did make a few slight modifications. I cut out some unnecessary steps and layering, I think, and I made some slight adjustments to some of the colors. So I basically just refined and streamlined the process, but it's largely the same. But the main difference here is I've hopefully given you a more extensive look at how to paint a larger area of the Italian camouflage, what to do when you really want to spend a little bit more time highlighting and shading. You really want to get a more, interesting effect, where you need to really just spend more attention and time on it than what I did before, where it was just a small amount of a sort of a tarp or bedroll. So again, I really like how this guy looks. I'm very pleased, particularly with how the camo pattern turned out on him. I think it's a really nice look. Again, this is a camo pattern that relies on traditional highlighting and shading as opposed to the sort of wash-based shading that I do on some more complicated patterns. And it has a clearly different look to it. I think I personally slightly prefer this look when you can pull it off, but it isn't possible on all patterns, but it does work very well on something like this. It has such large, bright areas of color. So once again, if you enjoyed this video, please like it, share it. Please leave me comments with what you thought. If you have any questions, I'm glad to hear from you. Also, don't forget to subscribe to my channel if you enjoyed what you saw so that you can keep up with my future updates, know what I'm working on. So I think that is all for now, and I will see you next time.